Recently I decided to rewatch the Pokemon anime from the very beginning. The world of Pokemon is inhabited by a huge roster of creatures known as Pokemon. At the time of the first season, there were 150 different kinds of Pokemon. Each one of these 150 Pokemon were classified under either one or two of a possible 15 different types. For example, Charmander was a fire type, Squirtle was a water type, and Bulbasaur was a grass and poison type. However, each Pokemon also had its own species. Caterpie was a worm Pokemon, and Beedrill was a poison bee Pokemon. And this is where this odd thought I've had comes to fruition. Where do animals fit in the world of Pokemon? It is a common misconception that Pokemon are animals. A reasonably understandable misconception, as a lot of Pokemon resemble animals that we know from our world. Pidgeotto looks like a bird, Zubat looks like a bat, and Meowth looks like a cat. So you are forgiven for thinking that Pokemon are the equivalent of real-world counterparts. However, is there any evidence that animals exist in the world of Pokemon? Well, in virtue of certain Pokemon being attributed to a certain species, such as Caterpie being a worm Pokemon, you could presume that in the universe, whoever's given Caterpie the distinction of a worm Pokemon has an idea about what a worm is. To extrapolate it further, Geodude is considered a rock species Pokemon. We don't consider Geodude to be a replacement for all rocks in the world of Pokemon, surely. You can't imagine a world with no rock. However, there is also physical evidence of animals in the world of Pokemon. In as early as episode 3, Ash catches a Pokemon, we see Pidgeotto eating a worm. This would imply that even though Caterpie is a worm Pokemon, there are actual worms in this world. But it gets a little confusing a few moments later when Misty scolds Ash for being stupid by sending out a Caterpie against a Pidgeotto when, to quote Misty,
Pidgeotto is a bird. Caterpie is a worm. Birds eat worms, Mr. Pokemon Master!
Moving on, in episode 4, Challenge of the Samurai, Ash makes an incredibly bad pun involving a cow costume.
Maybe it's a Counterpie!
While the wild bull Pokemon Tauros would feature later in the season, it wasn't until season 4 that the actual cow Pokemon Miltank was featured, but it's clear to see in this scene that Ash is clearly referring to a real-life cow. One of the more common examples of real-world animals in Pokemon is when we see fish. Episode 7, The Waterflowers of Cerulean City, takes place at Cerulean Gym, which has an aquarium which is clearly inhabited by fish we would recognise from this world. Fish would next feature in episode 16, Pokemon Shipwreck, and several times after that. Episode 20, The Ghost of Maiden's Peak, features a seemingly haunted shrine. It turns out the haunting has been perpetrated by the ghost Pokemon Ghastly, who, in order to fight off an attacking Ekans, a snake Pokemon, turns himself into a mongoose. It's one of the weirder episodes of Pokemon and probably the most overt use of a real-world animal ever in the series. As they expanded the roster of Pokemon in future seasons, the amount of times they did reference real-world animals decreased to the point where I don't think they've actually featured one in seasons now. Even if you want to write off the animals featured as a limitation of the time, it still wouldn't make sense that a living, breathing world would not have animals in it. The characters in this world have to eat, and we're shown them eating things such as lobster, and even fried chicken is mentioned.
I turned my back for a second and my pot disappeared! And my chicken too!
Pokemon is a children's anime, so they don't ever really delve into the ethics of killing a Pokemon or even eating a Pokemon, except in one scenario. At the end of episode 16, Pokemon Shipwreck, our main characters are stranded on a raft in the middle of the ocean. James at this point has in his possession the Pokemon Magikarp, which is clearly a fish, and as the characters are so hungry, they fantasize about eating Magikarp. It's the one and only time the show ever gets anywhere near to this topic, but it does imply it's an incredibly odd thing for them to be considering. It's explained that Magikarp is all scale and bone, so therefore not worth eating anyway, but it would make sense that if they're going to even try to eat a fish Pokemon, that fish would exist. It's been incredibly interesting putting my 21-year-old mind towards something that I first watched when I was about 7, but it does show that Pokemon, even now, is still giving me something to think about. Right, I'm off to start season 3.